Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Moses, President of the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, also known as LESPI. I'm glad to welcome you on this beautiful evening to our webinar, Kleindeutschland, Little Germany on the Lower East Side. For those of you who aren't familiar with LESPI, we're a not-for-profit group formed in 2007, whose mission is the preservation of the historic Lower East Side. This includes the East Village, Lower East Side below Houston Street, Chinatown, Little Italy, and the Bowery. We focus on advocating for the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission to designate new historic districts and individual landmarks in the Lower East Side, including through outreach and education events such as our programming tonight. Now, during the lecture, please put any questions you have in the quick Q&A section, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll answer as many as we can, but we may not be able to get to everybody's questions. We're now going to do a quick poll to see where everybody lives. So don't worry, the answers are anonymous. So here goes. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And I want to, let's see if I can show this thing. I never quite figured that out. Here we go. So, so you can see about 40% are in the Lower East Side, about 44% outside the Lower East Side, but in New York City, 9% in the tri-state area, 4% in the US outside the tri-state area, and 1% outside the US, which we're always excited to see. So welcome, everybody. Close this thing down. So I now want to introduce our speaker tonight, Richard Haberstroh. Richard is an accredited genealogist who has been deeply involved in genealogical research, both in the US and Germany since 1984. A frequent lecturer on German and New York genealogy, he has published numerous articles, including on his family's 19th century New York City German immigrant genealogy. He's also author of the book, The German Churches of Metropolitan New York, a research guide. During the pre-COVID days, Richard presented for LESPI live, so I know from personal experience, you're in for a real treat this evening. So thank you, Richard, and then let's welcome him.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I guess as in the spirit of full disclosure, as we sometimes say, I just want to let people know I'm not actually a historian by career choice or anything like that, but I am a professional, let's say, family historian or genealogist. And the reason I got interested in this subject was because I have 6 German ancestors who came here in roughly the mid 19th century, and of those 6, 4 of them did live on the Lower East Side in Kleindeutschland, Little Germany. So over the years, I've just got more and more interested in the history and a lot of different aspects of it. So I've been able to put together some material, and we better get started. So I just want to begin by giving a little overview of German immigration to the US. I think a lot of people aren't even aware of how many Germans immigrated to the United States, in particular in the 19th century. I tend to break it up into 3 different periods. There's a pre-1816 period, which was pretty much the colonial period. There wasn't too much immigration in general between the beginning of our country and around this 1816 date. 1816 is a critical year because it's sometimes called the year without a summer, in particular in Europe. So there were just huge crop failures in various parts of Europe, and that started to push certain people in the direction of the New World, in particular a number of Germans. It really represents the very beginning of at least 19th century immigration into the US by Germans. So that period begins about 1817, and I break it off at the Civil War, mainly because it just wasn't a good place for people to be immigrating to. So during the Civil War, so the numbers dropped significantly, but that was a very, very large and important period for immigration. It really established German communities in this country, including in New York City. And the third period would be 1865 after the Civil War up until the First World War. One thing of particular note in that period is that in the 1880s, there was a very large burst of immigration into this country from Germany. On this next chart, you'll see a graph broken down by decades, starting at 1820. And you can see the huge rise from 1820 to about 1860. There's a peak there, then it drops off because of the war. Then there's another big peak in the 1880s, after which it starts to drop off significantly. But in the course of that time, put this chart together. Well, I should say I borrowed this chart, and it shows the time periods on the left are a little odd, and I'm not sure why they were chosen initially, but you can see I plotted Irish versus German immigration just because the Irish were, especially early in the century, the biggest immigrant group into the United States and New York City in particular. So I thought it just is a good yardstick for how many German immigrants there were in the same time period. You see the Germans were kind of followed a similar pattern, and they both increased up until the middle of the 19th century. The Irish immigration tailed off a little more later in the century, whereas the German immigration just kind of kept increasing. So in the end, we ended up with something like 5.5 million German immigrants by the time of the First World War. It's always a little tricky defining German immigrants because sometimes people count Austrians and sometimes they don't, or German-speaking Swiss. So these numbers might even be a little on the low side, but that's always one tricky thing when you're looking at German immigration statistics. Well, what about the Germans in New York? Well, New York City became the busiest US immigrant port in the course of the early part of the 19th century. Earlier on, Philadelphia had been the largest, probably the largest port in general, but especially in terms of immigrants coming into the country. Part of the increase in US immigration and in the growing of the Port of New York in general was the fact that it gave direct access to the Erie Canal and to the Midwest as of about 1825 when the Erie Canal opened. It's been estimated that roughly 1/3 of the Germans who arrived in New York City actually settled here. That's a pretty high number, but pretty high percentage. And you can see that in 1855, 38% of 51,000 immigrants, German immigrants into New York City, declared that New York was their final destination. Because of all this immigration and how many Germans ended up settling in New York, it is sometimes said, and again, this depends on how you measure things exactly, but that New York City by the late 19th century was actually the third largest German city in the world after Berlin and Vienna. So it had extremely large number of German immigrants and their families living in New York by the end of the 19th century. New York didn't necessarily have the highest percentage of Germans in terms of the population. There were other places like Milwaukee and Cincinnati, smaller cities, actually had a larger German percentage of their population. But in terms of pure numbers, New York City was the leader. Another few statistics here, estimates of what percentage of the population in New York City was German American, in the sense of either German-born not citizens necessarily, German-born immigrants and their first generation of American-born family members. Again, you can see it's a very large percentage of the population in New York. And so where did most of these people go? Well, they could have gone to a lot of different places, but we'll talk a little bit about how they ended up to a large degree on what eventually became the Lower East Side, Little Germany, what is called at the time, or Kleindeutschland. And honestly, before I started researching my own family, I didn't know there was ever a significant German part of the population on the Lower East Side. And I guess it's because it developed pretty much when the Lower East Side was developing. And why did they settle there? Well, probably because that's where most of the working class housing either existed or was being built, beginning in the 1830s, which was when the German immigration was beginning to really take off. I have the map of New York City published in 1834. And what I like about this map, and there are a lot of others that you can find that are like it, it shows you, doesn't just show you the streets, it shows you where the areas are developed. And so you can see on the Lower East Side, if I'll point it out here, here's Tompkins Square, and you can see the area around Tompkins Square in the early 1830s is pretty much undeveloped. There's development to the south, down around Houston Street and south of Houston, but this whole big area on the east side is, as of yet, mostly undeveloped. On the west side, there was development going on and tenements being built north of Greenwich Village. So that was a little farther uptown. But for whatever exact reasons, it turned out that more of the German immigrants ended up settling well, I call it the Upper East Side at that time, but what became the Lower East Side. And I would point out also on this map, you can see how minimally developed these areas are, because we have the 11th Ward on the Lower East Side, but there isn't a 17th Ward yet, which doesn't get created until 1837. Was just west of the 11th Ward. And then the 18th Ward doesn't get created until, 1846. So, and most of that was just due to the increased influx of immigrants, and in this case of the Lower East Side, to a large extent, the German immigrants. So, as I just said, Kleindeutschland drew a large percentage of the German immigrants, and it became the main center of German culture in New York, really for the entire second half of the 19th century. But there were other places where there were significant enclaves of Germans. Just mention a few in Manhattan, the west side above 14th Street. Again, that was because there were tenements being built there to serve the immigrants, so a fair number ended up there. There was a pocket I'm not quite sure why, but I've noticed in the Soho area, a lot of German immigrants. Probably the most significant German area in the mid 1800s outside of Kleindeutschland was Williamsburg. When I look at census records and things like that, it almost looks like there are more German immigrants, or a denser area of German immigrants perhaps in Williamsburg than there are even on the Lower East Side in Kleindeutschland. And of course, those two areas are right across the river from each other. So there was some back and forth of immigrants, probably more of a movement from the Lower East Side at times to a slightly less densely populated Williamsburg. But the two communities seem to be very closely connected. There was only a short ferry ride. Another enclave of Germans was out in the town of Newlatz, which is eastern Kings County. It only became part of Brooklyn in 1886. We now think of that as East New York, or it was actually called East New York, but even as early as the mid 1850s, there were significant German presence there. Another important German enclave was in Melrose in the South Bronx. Was part of the town of Morrisania. That area was annexed in 1874, but well before that, there was already a large German presence. And we don't want to forget Jersey City and Hoboken right across the other river. And also some very tightly knit German groups. And as a matter of fact, there were multiple areas in Jersey City with German enclaves. And I should mention, probably most New Yorkers think of Yorkville as the German town, but that was almost like an offspring later on from Kleindeutschland as Germans moved uptown. And so that really began developing into a new German town in the 1880s and 1890s. Well, this next chart kind of shows you what a German genealogist does when he's bored. He takes a map from an old city directory and starts plotting where people with a certain name live. So I was trying one day to figure out what's the easiest way to do this. And I said, well, I'll just start with the Schmidts. There's always a lot of Schmidts. The name is pretty ubiquitous among German population. Like you'll find Schmidts in every different part of Germany. So I think I might have added a few other SCH names that are typically German surnames, but I just plopped them down with these little dots, and the red dots show where people named Schmidt lived in 1845. And the green dots are where all the Schmidts lived in 1850. And you can see there's, in that 5 years, there's already a significant increase in numbers. If you see yellow dots there, it's where there were German language churches. I only see 3 there. 2 of them I know were Roman Catholic churches. One was a Protestant church. But it's interesting how the dots are kind of really sort of congregating near those churches. And if we go a few years later to 1870, well, you can see that just the number of Germans living in this area has now increased tremendously. And remember, these are just the people named Schmidt. So it's interesting to see where the clusters are, like right below Tompkins Square, just like it was already in 1850. There was a big cluster. There's like a huge cluster now, all the way from Houston Street up to Tompkins Square. But the Kleindeutschland area, oh, I didn't. Well, okay, I'm sorry. I thought this was in a slightly different order, but anyway, just one thing about immigrants in general, and German immigrants in particular, they tend to, of course, live with people from the same ethnic group. And for the Germans, that was important because they were not native English-speaking people. So, of course, they tended to live with and marry other Germans. There's a few numbers there on the side. In 1850, and this data comes from Stanley Nagel's book, Little Germany, which is a very good book, covers a lot of aspects of Kleindeutschland. But in 1850, 92% of German-born were married to German-born. In 1880, now this is a little different. These are first-generation German Americans, but surprisingly, even the first generation, 95% were estimated to be married to other first-generation German Americans. That's German in general, but there was also a certain degree of regionalism among the Germans, because Germany was a pretty complex place, probably not so different than a place like Italy, where there are a lot of different dialects from north to south, different customs, different cultural aspects. So it's estimated that 72% of Bavarians in 1860 were married to other Bavarians. Now, the Bavarian tag is a little complicated, and I won't get into the details. It's just here as an example, because a lot of the Bavarian immigrants were from an area that was Bavaria then, but isn't now. So it can get a little confusing. But and then in 1880, you see that those numbers are dropping a little bit in terms of people being married to other Germans, being married to other Germans from the same part of Germany. Part of that could be just by mixing with all the different elements of the German community. People got to be more comfortable with them. The notes on the side, it's really, the point is just to show that Germany was a very complex state, let's call it. In the 19th century, technically it was made up of 39 sovereign countries, essentially just linked together in a very loose German confederation. So, you know, people related to people who were from their particular country, whether it was a kingdom or a grand duchy or a principality. They were technically citizens of different countries. They had tended to have different dialects, and different religions were more common in some areas than another. So it all kind of makes sense that people lived around people they were most comfortable talking to and dealing with on a social level. There were some small enclaves that developed within Kleindeutschland, so because of this regionalism. So in the book Little Germany, they happen to mention that Southwestern Germans often were found more in the upper wards. Hanoverians, people from the Kingdom of Hanover, which is in Northwest Germany, were more in the one of the lower wards, the 13th ward. Why exactly they ended up in those places, but the point is just that people tended to gravitate to their own kind. So I mentioned tenements, and basically life for the immigrant was tenement life. And as the Lower East Side developed from the 10th and the 13th ward and the 11th into the 17th ward, the more tenements had to be built, older tenements might be replaced. But there was a different character to the nature of the tenements in the different wards. The lower wards tended to have more smaller, older frame tenements. In some areas, there was more commercial buildings, and to the east, as you move closer to the water, there could be a certain amount of industry. The upper wards were a little more purely residential, but not completely. And they tended to be somewhat newer tenements, so they were mostly masonry, not so much frame buildings. And in general, there were a lot of pre-old law tenements. The old law was a Tenement Housing Act that was passed in 1879 that tried to improve the living conditions of the immigrants in the tenements. But an awful lot of the buildings, especially in the lower part of the Lower East Side, predated that law. And here's a very brief chronology of the tenement laws. There was in 1867, which just encouraged or required a window in every room. Apparently they weren't specific enough about what the windows needed to be open up to. So in 1879, they made it clear that the windows needed to open to the exterior. In the old format, that was kind of difficult, but the builders complied to a large degree by putting air shafts into the buildings so that windows could open up to the air shafts and not just to like the hallway or something like that. In 1887, privies had to be put in the interior of the buildings, and the new law of 1901 was probably the most sweeping. The windows had to be outward facing, not just facing an air shaft or a closed space. Courtyards were needed for sanitation, proper ventilation was required, and there were a few different requirements regarding fire safety. So it was a long process, but eventually the tenements became more and more livable. The early ones were fairly rough, as you can imagine, given the space and the size of the rooms. Here are just a number of photographs I took along the way. You can see a lot of the old tenements. Most of them, I'd say, are 4 and 5 stories. Down on the lower right, there's a row of them that are 3 stories, which is, to me, was kind of striking. Very different looking for the Lower East Side. One thing I noticed on the lower left side, there's this building with the name Katz on the top. And that has a date of 1890 on it. So that would be a post old law tenement. So, and you notice that the buildings on both sides are much taller, and it looks like the building, sort of as we view it behind it, probably had another building up against it. So I suspect that this slightly later tenement from 1890 was built there to replace a larger, older structure. That's just my assumption here. There's a couple of more pictures. I just love walking around the area and looking at the architecture, and especially when some of the ornamentation they bothered to put on these very fundamental forms of housing for working class and and even poorer than working class. It's just a really interesting cityscape. So this slide shows three different potential, they were probably actual tenement layouts. These would all be pre-old law tenements. So you don't see any sign of air shafts or courtyards. I mean, there was a yard in the back, probably contained the privies. In some places, there was a rear building. And you can see most of these are laid out. Well, they're probably all 25-foot wide lots, still are 25-foot wide lots. They're almost invariably 4 apartments, 2 a floor, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. And so you can see the left one there. These are 2-room apartments. I guess you'd call it a living room and a bedroom, but you'd probably use the space for whatever you needed to. In the center, you see 3-room apartments, a little bit larger. And to the right of that is another, they look like 3-room apartments also, just a slightly different kind of layout. But it's interesting when we look at how much people paid for these to live in these apartments. They were certainly modest, but it's hard for us to even imagine now paying $4 a month for any apartment, even like a shoe box. It probably costs more than $4 a month, but that was typical rent in the 1850s in Kleindeutschland and other tenement areas in New York City. $4 a month for 2 rooms, $8 to $9 a month for 3 rooms, and if you really want to splurge, 10 to 12 for 4 rooms. I mentioned before, in some areas you had industry interspersed with the housing. It seems that the 17th ward, around Tompkins Square Park, and a little bit to the west, and a little bit to the north, it seemed to retain its German character the longest. That could be due to just having newer, somewhat higher quality tenements in that area. People were more willing to keep their families there and not look to move out of the area. So that's what rents were typically in the tenements. This was considered a standard working man's annual budget in Kleindeutschland. And you can go down the numbers and see. One thing that sort of surprised me was that the cost of groceries was so much higher than the cost of rent. I'm not sure whether that usually happens nowadays, but you can see that $600 a year was what you would need just for this very basic budget living in Kleindeutschland. That's $12 a week. Salaries were not, I mean, they varied very much depending on what your occupation was, but they were generally not too much higher than that. So you would have to work pretty hard to live even in these tenements and still be able to save money. Now, it's interesting to look at what kinds of jobs that Germans in New York City tended to be employed in. It seems overall that among the immigrant population, Germans tended to be somewhat more employed in skilled trades. Probably is because of the whole emphasis on learning a trade in Germany, even among common people. Now, not everyone had the opportunity in Germany to, but there was more of an emphasis on learning a trade. They had a guild system for most occupations in Germany. So it just turns out that a high percentage of the people in certain occupations were German born in New York City. And this is in 1855. So you can see cabinet makers were pretty much close to the top of the list. Tobacconists, which could mean mostly cigar makers, barbers, locksmiths, shoemakers, bakers, etc. Of course, brewers. The German immigrants are the ones who essentially brought, or at least made popular, lager beer in the United States and in New York City in particular. And there were many, many breweries that popped up in the 19th century in New York. And I added fresco painter to the bottom of the list only because one of my ancestors, immigrant ancestors, was a fresco painter. I didn't even know there were fresco painters in the 19th century till I started researching the family. And it also turned out there was a German fresco painters union. So I don't know what that means in terms of what percentage of fresco painters were German, but there were a fair number. Probably not a lot of fresco painters in general, but the percentage who were German was probably significant in New York City at that time. Germans seem to have been less involved in some of what we might call the less favored occupations, laborer, porter, and clerk. Although I've seen plenty of German immigrants who were listed in the city directory as either rag pickers or night scavengers, and the night scavenger one in particular is not a well sought after occupation. Had to do with basically related to at least cleaning the privies at night. So I have a picture there on the right of maybe the most well-known cabinet makers, at least in New York City, were the Herder brothers. And I only learned of them from watching Antiques Roadshow, but they had a very large establishment right on the edge of Kleindeutschland, where they made a lot of their most famous cabinetry works. A couple of other things, statistics that are sort of interest had to do with other aspects of German life in Kleindeutschland. And one of them has to do with health. And this is kind of a very narrowly focused statistic. But you see the first column, Germans in 1855, it was estimated the Germans made up 29% of the population. This says the Irish were 54%. That sounds a little high, but it probably was somewhere around there. Admissions to Bellevue, though, for some reason, for Germans is very low. For Irish is very high. So that's the percentages of Bellevue admissions. Only 6% were Germans and 89% Irish. I have don't have much of an idea how to explain that, except it's possible this was shortly after the famine immigration from Ireland, and it probably was the poorest of the poor. Irish were coming over here in large numbers. That could account for it to a certain degree. They might have been living in more difficult situations because of the level of poverty, but it's an interesting statistic. There's one on crime, and oh yes, right. These numbers came from another interesting book on just immigrant life in general in New York City. That's Immigrant Life in New York City by Robert Ernst. I recommend that book also. But so the Germans seemed to be a relatively well-behaved bunch in New York City. The number of arrests, they represented 10%, which isn't a particularly large number. Now here's another strange statistic. And this one, it didn't come from that same book. It came from a newspaper article that I found. I believe it was published in 1869. I forget the newspaper, but it had statistics about the number of suicides by ethnicity in New York City. And the Germans outpaced everyone easily. And this was kind of curious to me, especially since I had heard that committing suicide is sometimes called the Dutch Act. And I've actually looked it up on the internet to try to find out why, and people come up with a lot of theories. And when I see numbers like this, I think, well, perhaps it's just that German immigrants had the reputation for ending it. Why they would? Could it be because a lot of them felt more isolated because of language or whatever? But it's, again, another interesting statistic. So, and of course, an important life for anyone in the city, and especially immigrants, is the social life with other immigrants. And Germans, like every other immigrant group, tended to socialize with other Germans, people of their ethnic group. The Germans seem to have a little more of a tendency towards joining clubs and societies, and not just totally informally socializing. Another thing that's sometimes said about the Germans in general, but especially the German immigrants in this country, a large part of the population was not particularly religious. And so they're sometimes broken up into the idea of church Germans versus club Germans. And I'm sure and know that there was, an intermingling of the two. It isn't as simple as that, but there was a tendency for some people to be more connected to their religious institution or otherwise to different kinds of social institutions. So for the church Germans, they'd go to church functions and various religious organizations that were connected to the churches. They could meet with people there. If you were not so much of a churchgoer, there were all kinds of social clubs and benevolent and fraternal societies of various kinds based on various different commonalities, be it where you came from in Germany or just what your interests were in terms of social action and that sort of thing. And of course, if you were a German American in New York City and you just wanted to informally socialize, there were the beer gardens, the lager beer saloons, and concert halls and theaters, which were fairly numerous in Kleindeutschland, especially a lot of them were along the Bowery at different times. So I mentioned religion. I'll just briefly mention that in terms of the Christian denominations, the Germans pretty much transferred their denominations from Germany to here. In Germany, the three major Christian denominations are, well, in order of popularity, probably were Lutheran, Catholic, and Reformed. And in this country, that's what most of the German language churches ended up being. And the German churches served the purpose of facilitating retention of the German language and traditions for the immigrants, although in a number of cases, if there were German speakers in the congregation and English speakers, there'd be fighting over, well, we're going to have the German service first or the English service first, and things like that caused a lot of bad blood, and sometimes caused congregations even to split up. Now, aside from those three main German Christian religions in this country, there were a lot of non-German denominations who opened mission churches to try to serve the immigrant population, and in this case, the German-speaking population. So there were a lot of Presbyterian, Methodist, and Episcopal mission churches specifically for Germans, and Baptist. I didn't mention there. Another aspect of religious life in New York City was that there were a lot of independent German ministers who they might try to form a little congregation. It might succeed for a few years, it might not. But it seems like one of their main jobs was performing marriages. So as a genealogist, I always hope that if I'm researching family, no one was married by one of these independent ministers, because basically there are no records or no significant records from a lot of the marriages that they performed. There were also, it's not exactly the same as religion, but there were a lot of German rationalists and free thinkers, and they had this one fellow in particular, Philip Merkel, was well known for establishing the German Universal Christian Church, which was, it was, as far as I can tell, Christian in name, but very progressive and rational and open-minded in general in terms of its approach to Christianity. And he also started the Harugari Society, which I'll mention a little bit later. Just to show a few of the old churches from Kleindeutschland, St. Nicholas German Catholic. That was the first German Catholic church in New York City, founded in 1833. Trinity Lutheran, well, it ended up on 9th Street, was founded in 1843. I can't say that was the first German Protestant church in New York City, because they're St. Matthew, founded in 1820, had roots in earlier colonial Lutheran churches. So that goes back well into the 1700s, and I believe into the 1600s. But Trinity Lutheran might have been one of the first large congregations established by German Lutheran immigrants. Unfortunately, both of these structures are not in existence anymore. Two others, just quickly: Most Holy Redeemer on 3rd Street, which, by the way, was only a block and a half away from St. Nicholas. There was one of these cases where the congregation split up over various issues. But so Most Holy Redeemer is still there on 3rd Street. If you look at the images, the original tower was way taller than I guess the new improved tower. I think they were having some structural issues with the tower, and at one point they had to reduce the height of it. St. Mark's Lutheran Church was on 6th Street. Thankfully, the building is still there. It's now used by a Jewish congregation, the 6th Street community. I had the great pleasure, actually, to see the inside of it. It's very interesting. There was a tour that was given of the building a few years back. Let's see. Well, so in terms of the Jewish population coming from Germany, that immigration of Germans to the United States caused a very large increase in the Jewish population in New York. In 1843, there were 6 synagogues in New York, 2 of them in what we would call Kleindeutschland. By 1870, there were 27 synagogues, and 14 of them were in Kleindeutschland, and most of them south of Houston Street, which I guess is what sort of became the center of gravity of the Jewish community on the Lower East Side later on in the century. And it's said that in 1870, about 2/3 of the Jewish population in New York City was German. So this groundswell of German immigration brought a lot of the Jewish population to the United States, and really laid the groundwork for the later Jewish community that grew to be much larger even at the turn of the 20th century. A couple of old synagogues in the area, and forgive me if I mispronounce the names. I would Anshe Shezed, Rodef Shalom. The one on the left was founded in 1829, which was before there was much German immigration into the area, but according to descriptions of its history, by the late 1830s, it was pretty much totally German just because of the immigrants into the area. And the synagogue on the right was founded in 1842 specifically by German immigrants. And I believe these buildings are still there and still in use. So that's some of the religious aspects of Kleindeutschland. There were a lot of other ways outside of the churches and synagogues that people would socialize, as I said, and this is just kind of a laundry list. Singing and music societies were big. The Turner Society was a gymnastics, specifically German gymnastics society that encouraged health of mind and body. And I probably don't have enough time to describe all of these specifically, but over here on the right, speaking of the Turner Society, there was a Turner Society, the Turnverein, as it was called, building on East 4th Street in Kleindeutschland, and that's a little picture from a get-together. I guess they were basically exhibiting their gymnastics skills at various get-togethers and parks. Jones's Wood was a popular park for these kinds of German get-togethers. So, as I mentioned, music was really a big part of German culture, and it ranged from brass bands in the street to orchestral societies that were a little more highbrow, perhaps, one would hope. And along with music in that sense, singing societies were a very large part of German culture. And shortly after the end of the Civil War, there was apparently this, as they called it in the newspaper, a monster picnic at Jones's Wood. 130 singing societies from the New York metropolitan area, including Philadelphia and Baltimore, all came up to New York for this. I suppose it was in part a celebration of the end of the Civil War. Another common aspect of German culture that we find in Kleindeutschland was the Schützengesellschaft, which Schützen sounds like it means shooting, and it's sort of called like a shooting society. Schützen is really means protection. So there was a Deutsch-Amerikanische Schützengesellschaft Halle, 12 St. Mark's Place. It's a lovely old building. It's still there. You see a picture on the right of some people at shooting booths, which wouldn't have been in the building, but they probably would have been at some park. Again, maybe Jones's Woods. And I sometimes have to laugh at the picture with the old guy. There's nothing that makes me more comfortable than an old guy with a stein of beer and a rifle. It's like, but I guess it's just the way it was. And I mentioned the Harugari Society. It's just one of many fraternal organizations. This one is very specifically German-based. There were other like German Odd Fellows and German Masons that weren't originally German, but this was established in 1847 by that Philip Merkel that I mentioned before, and a number of other people. And it was kind of a mutual protection society in part, was also meant to preserve the German language and culture. The thing I would probably like best about it, it prohibited discussions of religion, politics, and social issues. I guess people had a lot to say about the weather. There were a lot of other kinds of social clubs. I like putting this picture up. It happens to be a family photograph. The guy seated on the left is my great-grandfather. He happened to work at the German Exchange Bank and became friends with a few brewers, who I think that's who those other three guys are. The two on the right almost certainly being brothers, I believe. But he belonged to things called like the White Hi-Hat Association, which I never found out too much about, and the Schnorrer Club of Mauritania, which is somewhat better known. And they were mainly just social clubs for people who wanted to hang out with both politicians and businessmen. I mean, that seemed to be the focus. Usually it was more geared towards one political party than another. I think in the case of the Schnorrer Club, there was democratically oriented. I better move along quickly. A favorite spot for socializing was always the beer halls and the dance halls and saloons. Some were combinations of the above. There were a lot of them on the Bowery on Avenue A. This was wholesome family entertainment, even though they were serving beer. And I always like the quote at the bottom, beer, dance, business. That is the world of the German Volkes in New York. It's like living in Buffalo. I don't really know what that means, but I know there are a lot of Germans in Buffalo. There was one major bone of contention between the beer hall owners and the rest of society, and that was the blue laws in this country. And there was a fellow named Gustavus Lindenmüller who owned one of the beer halls, and he seemed to be a bit of a character. You see him pictured on a Civil War token that he issued as currency for his beer hall. But to make a long story a little bit shorter, in order to skirt the blue laws, he founded the German Shakers Society. And so then he would claim, well, you know, we're having religious concerts on Sunday in the Odeon Theater. So he used it as an excuse to stay open and, of course, serve beer. But he got in a lot of trouble, and but they never seemed to be able to shut him down completely. And over time, the German population and the authorities seem to have come to some understanding about being open on Sunday and being able to serve beer, since it was such a big part of German culture. And sometimes Sunday was the only day of the week that people had to go out and relax and socialize. Beer halls are not to be confused with lager beer saloons, and which are smaller establishments, usually the front room of a tenement building on the ground floor, where you might have some other kind of shop. But instead of selling some clothing or something or shoes, they basically sold lager beer. And it was estimated in 1885 by the Christian Union, a temperance publication in New York, that there were over 300 saloons on the Lower East Side. And a little section of a map down on the lower left shows each dot. The crosses are churches, if you can make out the crosses. The dots are wherever place there was a saloon in that section of town. And it's almost amazing. The Lower East Side Tenement Museum has restored and to a certain degree recreated a typical saloon on the Lower East Side at 97 Orchard Street. It's really an interesting view into what that whole life was about. There were only two other little rooms attached to the front room, which was the bar area. The other rooms was a kitchen used to prepare food for customers, and then a bedroom. That was pretty much the entire tenement. But it's an interesting display. So the printed word, there are remnants of that still on the Lower East Side from Kleindeutschland. The Ottendorfer Library was established in 1884 on 2nd Avenue. And if you can see it in the picture, in the center of the picture, to the right of it is a building that was called the German Dispensary, built about the same time, I believe by the same people. So the Ottendorfer Library, it wasn't just a German language library, although they felt the need to supply books in German, but they made a point of making half the library English to try to help the assimilation of the Germans into society. And I believe it was the first free lending library in the city. There were a lot of German newspapers. The New Yorker Staatszeitung was one of them. And the buildings that are seen here, you can see how large the building grew to in 1873. There were a number of newspapers, but that was the most successful. And it still, I believe, exists in some form, not published in New York, though. Its buildings were located down in Chatham Square, which was called Newspaper Row. I'll just go through these quickly. There are other financial institutions. Germania Insurance, that building is still in existence. The German Exchange Bank is, I believe, now converted into apartments, but the building still exists. I'm not sure about Germania Bank, what its status is right now. Just a few well-known German Americans, Steinway, of course, August Schoenberg, better known as August Belmont, a very famous financier. Of course, his name is all over the New York area. I believe the family changed the name to Belmont because in the early 1800s, they lived in an area of Germany that was occupied by the French under Napoleon. So everything was in French, and they probably decided it was a good time to sort of translate the name Schoenberg into Belmont, which is what we know the family as. Oswald Ottendorfer was the editor of the New Yorker Staatszeitung and active in a lot of social things. I have to move along here, I believe. So I will just mention that probably some of the best off German immigrants, and sometimes their first American-born generation, were the brewers George Ehret in 1877 had the largest brewery in the country, and Jacob Rupert and their families actually ended up marrying, was only ranked number 8 in 1877. There were many, many breweries. A lot of them sprung up just north of Kleindeutschland, but they were a major part of the scene. Now, in 1904, there was a horrible disaster. St. Mark's Church was running a picnic for not just for the members of the church, but specifically for the members of the church and any friends or whatever who wanted to come along. They were taking a steamboat called the General Slocum up the East River. I forget exactly what the destination was, but there was a fire in the engine room. The whole ship burned. You can see in the picture the before and after. Down on the lower left, you see all the hearses running through Kleindeutschland, and over 1,000 were killed. It was up until the World Trade Center disaster. It was the largest, in terms of the number of people killed, the largest disaster, certainly in New York history. I don't know about in US history, but it was a horrible, sad event. There's a memorial fountain in Tompkins Square Park. It's kind of interesting, like a pinkish kind of marble. In Lutheran Cemetery, now called All Faiths Cemetery out in Queens in Middle Village, there's a much larger memorial there in the cemetery. Okay, so what happened to Kleindeutschland? Basically, well, times change, populations change. The German immigrants assimilated. They were more prosperous, so they could move out of the old neighborhood. A lot of them moved uptown and out of town. The Lower East Side, over time and over the course of the 19th century, started to draw, I'm sorry, I'm talking to the wrong bullet, but development was just moving northward. So there were more tenements and better built tenements, better living conditions as you move north. So that's where a lot of them ended up going, including up to Yorkville. So the Lower East Side also became a center for the new Eastern Europeans, including a lot of the Jewish population from Eastern countries, but also Poles, Hungarians, and actually at this time, not so much Eastern European, but Italians too were also becoming part of the mix of immigrants. The General Slocum disaster, people debate how important it was to the moving of the Germans out of the area. I would call it a landmark event, even if it isn't a major cause of the shift. I mean, by 1904, the German population was starting to move out of the area already. And World War I was probably, it's a little after the fact, and yet it caused a certain amount of suppression of German language and culture in the United States, just because now we're at war with Germans, and anything German, in particular, anything in the German language became very suspect. So there's a lot that's been written on these topics, and this is just a very brief little summary. Here are some references. A lot of them I find well, they're all interesting to me. And there's one or two that are in German, but there's A Little Germany and Immigrant Life in New York City. The two on the top are really great. The third book, Reading German Immigrant Letters, is very, very interesting. At the bottom of the list, I have something that I just ran across randomly, someone named Maggie Blank has a website. It just happens to have a lot of material on the Lower East Side and Kleindeutschland. So I stuck that on there too. And okay, I made it through all that material in a reasonable amount of time, I think. That's my email. And there's also a German genealogy group. A lot of times people who are interested in ethnic neighborhoods have some interest in genealogy. So they're a very good group that's been around since about 1990. Very helpful to anyone interested in that. And if anyone would like to contact me by email, haberstroh.r@gmail.com. Open to comments, questions, whatever. And I think that's it.
Well, Richard, that was great. Thank you. Before we get to questions, I wanted to make one point, just to point out Herder Brothers Furniture, which is, as Richard pointed out, was one of the top furniture makers of the 19th century, certainly in New York, maybe in the entire country. The Metropolitan Museum here in the city has a nice collection of Herder Brothers furniture. So if you want to see it in person, you can go there. Even if you check on the website, the Met's website, you'll see that they posted examples of Herder Brothers furniture. And it really is a spectacular, wonderful craftsmanship. Another thing I wanted to mention was that Lesby has a Flickr page, which has a lot of miscellaneous Lesby photographs, but also have, especially of our events and that type of thing. But we also have what we call our family albums, where people who have photographs of their families in the Lower East Side, the ideal ones would be taken outside and you could see it's really Lower East Side, but it really could be anything taken, at that time in the Lower East Side, even if it's interior shots. We would like to see people's families and collect people's families, the photographs, so that we just get a critical mass of a feeling of how people lived back then. So if you have anything on any photographs you'd like to share, you can send them off to info@lesby-nyc.org. And if you have some words that you could write about them, that's great, but you don't necessarily have to. So let's get to the questions. Let's see. I think we kind of covered about the Germans moving uptown on the Upper East, up to the Upper East Side. And then I think that the marriage statistics that you gave, someone asked about what are the SWers, which I think were people who lived in southwestern Germany, right, Richard?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't explain that well. Yeah, SW just means southwestern Germans, and they were being compared to the Bavarians, who were actually southeastern Germans, and yet they're significantly related for various reasons.
So Lynn points out that there's a rear building, like the far left diagram on your pre-law tenement plans. Right. There's a rear building behind a vintage furniture shop on West 17th Street. There's another one on 14th Street on the south side that I know of. Actually, a friend of mine lived in the rear building, which was a nice apartment when he lived there, but probably 100 years ago wasn't such a great place to live. But they are around. If you can get a hold of a Sanborn map, these are insurance maps of New York that are still produced today, and but they go back quite a few years also. But you can look around and you can easily see the difference between the old law tenements. I mean, the pre-law tenements, which tend to be rectangular shaped plans, as Richard said, without any kind of air shaft. And then what's known as the dumbbell tenements, you can see which are the pre-law tenements starting in 1879. and then the new law tenements have much more light and air, and they tend to be much bigger from 1905. So you can see all those on these Sanborn maps. And when you walk around the Lower East Side, you can also get a sense just by kind of looking at the size of the buildings. Another giveaway on the old law tenements is a lot of them have wood cornices, and the wood cornices are still there. You have to look closely because it's hard to tell they're wood. Sometimes the wood was actually painted with sand, so that it really looked like stone. But if you look carefully, you know, a lot of the pre-laws had wood, and then the old laws tended to have tin or some other kind of sheet metal. So let's see what we have here. Paula says that her ancestors, the Diefenbachs, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, lived in Ward 18, District 14. Where may that have been located? I believe they arrived in the late 1840s.
The 18th Ward is on the east side, right above 14th Street. I mean, the best way to find out where exactly they were living is to either use the city directories, which you can find online in a number of places. They were sort of like phone books before there were phones, and they would canvass entire neighborhoods and just collect the names and addresses of essentially everyone in the city. So those are available online, and you can just look up a name and see exactly where the location is. There are also maps of Manhattan that break the wards down into the sub-districts of the wards. And I mean, again, you can find them online, but there are a number of ways to figure out exactly where your immigrant ancestors lived. Sometimes the censuses before 1870 won't have addresses, so you can find them in a census, but you still don't know exactly where they live. So the other resources are helpful.
Lynn writes, I understand the Germans also participated in musical organizations, which I think you mentioned. I believe my great-great-grandfather played the tuba in one in Brooklyn. William writes, since the nation of Germany did not come into existence until 1870, did the immigrants identify from the region they emigrated from?
Yeah, they did, but that whole question of when did Germany become a country it's not as simple as that there was not a Germany before 1871. I mean, for 1,000 years there was a German Empire until like the early 1800s, and Napoleon basically put an end to that. But so there was a Germany with an emperor for 1,000 years. It's the period from, let's say, 1805 to 1871. There was still a German confederation. I mean, I'm using the dates very roughly here, but there was a North German Confederation, there was a General German Confederation at different times. But so technically the states were autonomous countries, but they did still have a confederation. And there was actually, for example, a German army during that time that was put together by the confederation. But people, I think even more so than Germans relating to whether they were from the Grand Duchy of Baden or the Kingdom of Hanover, it was more a linguistic and cultural thing, I think, that kept them together. I mean, they probably by the 1800s, most of them didn't care what the name of their particular region was. But they knew what they were in terms of their language and dialect and cultural situation and customs. I hope that's a cohesive answer.
Betty writes, on one of the slides, there was a figure of a man's face from a facade of a typical tenement building. The detail of the man's face in stone, I think. Do you know
Right.
who that is a figure of? And was it German or another nationality? And then she notes that there are some like that on the front of where I live in the East Village.
He just always assumed that that was kind of a standard ornamental thing. I have a piece of furniture from like 1890 that was passed down in the family, and it has a similar kind of face carved into the front of it. I have to admit I don't really know the origins of it, but I see that kind of decoration on a lot of things from that time period. I don't know if it's supposed to harken back to like a pagan god or just force of nature. I'm not really sure.
So we have a couple of thank yous that were expressed in the Q&A, and thank you for expressing those feelings. One is in German, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. Richard, I don't want to slaughter your ancestral language here, but you can take a look if you want and see it. And I think that wraps up. Oh, here's the last minute. Were the Germans oriented toward assimilation? And if yes, how did they do this? Jill writes that.
I can't claim to be an expert on that. I can only base it on what I've seen doing, researching my family and a lot of other people's families in the area. I think there was like I think it's hard to generalize. They were encouraged by different institutions, and just maybe it was their nature and most people's nature to preserve their language and culture. On the other hand, they would see assimilation as, you know, the way to get ahead and the way to do better. And I think they totally accepted the fact that they had to learn to speak English, even if they tried to keep German somehow alive. So I think the impression I get is just that they wanted to assimilate, and they tried to balance it with preserving language and customs. And I think the whole preserving language and customs got much more difficult after World War I. It was, I don't know if it was so much in the city, but in rural America after World War I, learning German was actually banned in many, many places. So, and even my own great-grandmother, after the war or during the war, she changed her name from Haberstroh to Haberstroh, because Haberstroh is an English name, even though I don't think anyone would know the difference between Haberstroh and Haberstroh. But she, on censuses, she started to claim that she was English, and she changed the name to Haberstroh. Her son, my grandfather, was already married with children, so that could be the reason why he didn't bother changing anglicizing the name. But my only point is that there was a lot of pressure after World War I to, you know, just be American among the German Americans.
Well, the Germania life insurance building on Union Square, you know, was changed to Guardian Life right around that time. And
right. Yeah, I think
they actually changed it to Guardian because they could reuse as many letters as possible from Germania to Guardian. on the neon sign at the top of the building. So
Funny.
building is still there. It's a landmark. It's now a W Hotel. So, but it was
Okay.
built as the Germania life insurance building. Paul writes, I'd be curious which Catholic schools in New York City were taught by German religious orders. The German American nuns who taught my grandmother in New York City referred to her as Fräulein O'Callahan.
I think the only Catholic schools that had German religious in them were probably the ones associated with the German national churches, like Most Holy Redeemer, St. Nicholas, St. John's on the west side, is a St. Francis on the west side. And I know that was the case also in Williamsburg with Most Holy Trinity, with the Catholic Church there. So I don't think that there were really any, and I'm saying this only because it makes sense to me that I don't think there would be a lot of German religious in the Catholic schools that were not part of the German Catholic churches. I'm not totally sure.
Howard writes that Hamburg Street in Brooklyn, the name of the street was changed to Wilson Avenue during World War I.
That's right. And there's another street, I can't remember the original name, but in East New York, in the German area, I forget the original name, but after World War I, it got changed to Liberty Street.
So I think that covers what we can go over today. And I want to thank you so much, Richard. That was so great, so informative, really full of very interesting information. So thank you so much.
I hope everybody enjoyed it and got something out of it. I probably tried to pack too much in to an hour, but
no,
I
it was
just rushed a little there, but good.
So for those of you who have missed some or all of tonight's presentation, it will be posted on LESP's YouTube channel, along with other past webinars that we've presented. So you can check that out if you go to our website, which you'll see here on the screen, www.lesp-nyc.org, and you scroll down, you'll see webinars. That'll take you to our YouTube channel. And if you join our YouTube channel, whenever we post another webinar, which we do every so often, the channel will notify you that there's a new one posted if you're interested in Lower East Side history and that type of thing. So we recommend you keep an eye open for future LESP webinars, including lectures and book talks. And you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to keep up to date with what's going on with LESP and preservation on the Lower East Side. And finally, please consider making a donation today to LESP. We do need donations to help us continue to produce free webinars such as this one and to continue our advocacy work for Lower East Side landmarking. You can find a donate button on your original invitation to this event and at the website shown here. So I want to thank you all again for attending, and I hope everyone has a very good night. Thank you again.
Richard.